All right. We're still sitting up, but you've all been so good to come today. I'm going to go ahead and begin and let some of the organization follow along. Thank you so much for coming, people of Corning, people of Steuben, and we even have friends from Allegheny County. Maybe there are some other counties represented here, our neighbors in Chemung. I think I saw some Union folks over from Chemung, and maybe we've even got someone from Yates looking around to see if they came down with me from Penn Yan this morning. Today's the day we are celebrating labor. I'm going to give an address, but before I get into the pedantic details of why and how we're going to celebrate Labor Day, I just want to say congratulations to be in the United States of America, where we can celebrate a day like this. We can respect our past, we can recognize where we are, and we can set a path and where we need to go for the future. And that's what this campaign is all about. So on reflections on the history of Labor Day, let me say, at the founding of our republic, the United States maintained two forms of labor, free and slave. It's important to remember that the notion of free was relative. It derived from a contrast to the feudal system where people were serfs and by law did not have freedom to move from one job or serfdom area to another. They were bound to their masters by law. The resurrection of an ancient form of labor, slave, through the European connections with Africa and the settlement of the Americas, ultimately highlighted the contrast between free and slave. The Civil War and the 13th Amendments to the Constitution, as we all know, ended slavery in the United States and consolidated the political economy of this country around a free capitalist system of labor. But let's be clear, consolidation did not end exploitation. The modern American labor movement grew out of exploitation of workers in mines, in steel mills, factories, trades, service industries around the turn of the last century. Its efforts to bargain collectively for workplace conditions, health and safety, wages and hours culminated in the passage of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. We commonly call it the Wagner Act. And that codified rules for organizing, bargaining, and basic unfair labor practices. The Wagner Act was part of an array of New Deal legislation that laid the foundation for a more prosperous, equal, and just society that flourished in the United States after the Second World War. And the efforts to make for a better society for a greater number of people continued with the emergence of civil rights movements for African Americans, Latinos, indigenous people, women of all races, ethnicity, and classes, the disabled, and the LGBTQ community. But whether people experience this flourishing, 5 principal factors made for the experience the United States had in the 50s to the 70s, roughly. The flowering of the American empire that began in our own territory culminated in the successful expansion of ambition and energy abroad in the successful 20th century world wars that the United States won. Immigration of people from all over the world who believe in American ideals and were willing to work and fight for them. Our parents, our cousins, our sons, our daughters. Part of really what made this country flourish. The labor movement that stabilized deep economic and social tensions that were bubbling 100 years ago. Government investment in agriculture, housing, education, infrastructure, the environment, science and technology, research and higher education, industry such as Corning, and finally, a progressive tax that balanced production and wealth. These were all the features that, if we can borrow a phrase, to the degree that it was great, made this country great in the 20th century. And labor played a critical role in that development, and that essentially, from a historical perspective, is what we celebrate today. But of course, the story did not end there. By the late 1970s, economists now recognize the earning power of wages lessened and stagnated, a pattern that has continued unto today. Tax on wealth overreached. At one point, it was over 90% on the highest earners. It prompted an overcorrection and a wealth discrimination. The levels went down precipitously for the 1%, and not so much for working and middle-class people, a pattern that has continued unto today. And if anyone wants evidence, the 2017 Tax Cut Act should give you all you need to know about it. Internal corruption and a too cozy relationship, in some instances, with organized crime weakened the labor movement. Chinks in an armor that management ruthlessly took advantage of. And that's a pattern of weakening labor that exists unto today. A multifaceted civil rights movement allowed violence to overwhelm and splinter its united, peaceful origins, and also allowed reactionary elements to define it away from a focus on common sense goals of justice and equality, also a pattern that exists unto today. And there's much more to add to the mix. A more thoughtful and just engagement in foreign relations, including the tragic experiences in Vietnam, Central and South America, and the Middle East, we did not have. The lack of meaningful regulation of corporate globalization and the failure of our government to mitigate the disruptive impact that would have, especially among our workers in industrial manufacturing. There was no policy to help people out. The unwillingness of our government to value small and middle class size farmers in the face of industrial agriculture goes on today, right here in this county, in this district. And the absence of meaningful policy around healthcare, education, infrastructure, environment to keep pace with profound technological and social change. We haven't had it. And then the rapacious, unchecked greed and blind ambition and adoration of power for its own sake in corporations as well as in the highest levels of our government and Congress exists today. Right. And so we arrive at this moment, and if one is not aware of the very serious fault lines all of these factors have combined to create for the future of a democratic republic and the expectations for children to enjoy an economically stable society, a trusted government, an environmentally safe place, if you're not aware of these fault lines, you're not paying attention. But you are here today because you are paying attention. You are alarmed. You do care. You want measured change that will not simply get us back to a fabled golden age, but will move this country forward in keeping with the best of its culture and traditions. And in that sense, I am a conservative. I believe in equality, justice, and opportunity. I believe that our Constitution holds promise to achieve these time-honored aspirations. Carefully tailored legislation can correct economic and social ills without blocking innovation. Taxes can be reasonably progressive and brought back in balance for the benefit of a healthy and stable working and middle class society while still incentivizing economic development. Healthcare, education, infrastructure, and environmental policies should be established to provide for and not to punish people, no matter who they are and on what side of the tracks they grew up. Protests must be peaceful and participated in as the means to realize meaningful reform. The responsibilities of governance must also be done in the name of public service, not personal self-aggrandizement. To get this country back on a path of achieving those goals, we must first remove corrupted politicians. Those addicted to their own blind ambitions and greed, deaf to the needs of their constituents, to hunger, to children without health care, to people who have no opportunities and a lack of education in order to realize their potential. We have to remove politicians who are cynical about the very people who continue to vote for them or who have served their country with the last full measure of their devotion. Open your ears, voters of the 23rd District. Hear the call for change that will help you. Set aside the partisan politics to see how you have been hoodwinked into going against your own ideals, principles, and needs. Clear your hearts to feel compassion for yourself, but a kind of compassion that is not based just on a reflection of you, but of all the citizens and people in the United States. That's the kind of open heart compassion we need to support good politics. People like all of you who believe in the promise of the United States. The system of labor and the production of wealth has not essentially changed in this country since the end of the Civil War. To be sure, we now live in an information economy where data and the people who generate it, us, are the commodity. An economy that has displaced millions of industrial manufacturing workers of the last century. But that there are people who take advantage of this production of wealth for the absence of rules that would make for a more just society is like adding new wine to old bottles. We must have change towards more just goals. Campaign finance reform. Our tax system, our healthcare system, the widening gap between haves and have-nots, the savage inequalities that still exist in our public schools, the wildly disparate availability and accessibility to infrastructure such as the internet or public transportation, unchecked police brutality, as well as the unfair overburdening onto our law enforcement of other underfunded roles such as social work, addiction treatment, mental health, abuse and neglect of children, and domestic violence. And it is for all of these reasons that we must revive the United States labor movement. 100 years ago, the labor movement helped stabilize a fractured and frustrated society. Labor supported the efforts to work in the name of both laborers and management. labor unions endorsed meaningful and enduring programs such as Social Security. In the 1960s, they called for the existence and expansion of Medicare, and to today, for a living wage for workers. As a candidate for Congress, I call for reform of the National Labor Relations Act to make it more amenable to the 21st century economy and its workers. Definitions of organizing and collective bargaining must be revised, and we need Congress to do it. It is federal law to move beyond the shop floor style of labor upon which it was originally set in the 1930s and more into a gig economy where so many of our workers are, and they need labor's help to organize and get a fair wage and fair conditions. So let's leverage what the labor movement did for the United States historically into what it can do for us today to unite and stabilize our society. I call for farmers to join with workers and workers to join with farmers in mutual respect for these joint goals. Let's find our way back to the cherished values: a more perfect union, a shared purpose, unity for a change, a revived purpose grounded in fundamental principles of our Constitution, and a rule of law beginning with rules to be sure we have a president who works for the people of the United States and not for himself and his family. And for a Congress that works for the people whom they represent and not for their own medical debt collection service by voting against health care every single time it comes before the desk in Congress. Who cares about the farmers? Who cares about children? Doesn't hold up a Farm Bill Act because he's trying to reduce food stamps, but let it pass so we can get credit to the farmers who need it. We can get infrastructure developments out to the farms struggling to compete. And so we can feel as if we are living in a society unified and not splintered, divided with anger and resentment. So let us share today in the celebration of the labor movement, of what labor has done for this country. Let us celebrate its stabilizing and organizing purposes so that we may unite to use electoral process to get people out of government who do not deserve to be there. They do not deserve public trust. And let's get the change we all know is right for you and all the people in the United States of America. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.